So, Sam, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes or so, maybe 15. We'll see how it goes. But basically, yes, I grew up. I'm going to give you a kind of brief survey of different parts of my life so you get a sense. I don't know whether you're acquainted with Wordsworth. The child is father of the man. So I was born on the 10th of May 1940. Now, does anybody in this room know what happened on the 10th of May 1940, apart from the fact that I was born, because I've just told you? Anybody know?
Winston Churchill being appointed Prime Minister.
That is correct. That was at about 6 o'clock in the evening. But something else happened, curiously, as I was born at about 5:30 in the morning. And it was the fact that Hitler then invaded Holland and France. That was the beginning of the Second World War. Nothing to do with me, but on the other hand, it's a very strange kind of serendipity, really. And then, in a nutshell, my father was he was a young officer in the artillery. He went out to Normandy in 1944, and I was 4 years old. He was fighting against the Jugend-Hitler Panzer Division, and he won the Military Cross, was killed, and I grew up in that kind of environment. So I had a sort of sense of being, and also not aware of the loss, because you're at that age, you don't realize that. So basically, I then go to my mother very sensibly and happily married again to another artillery officer, and she and I were brought up in Sheffield, which was an incredibly good experience, because some of you come from the north, I think, and you see that the world doesn't just live in London. It's a very different world. And I was brought up with, I played cricket with miners and steel workers. I played rugby with them. In other words, I became a real person. If I can put that around. And on top of that, I also went to school, and I went to a school which won 7 VCs, which is pretty remarkable in its own way. It's called Stonyhurst up in Lancashire. So I'm basically London born, but actually brought up in the real world. I then went to Oxford University, and I played cricket, read history, and got into Yorkshire trials. I was quite good at cricket, but it gave me a sense of competition, you know? And then after that, I went into the law, and I became, just simply because of my interest and curiosity about government and how it operated, it became very fascinating to me, because at Oxford I'd done 18th century history, which is really, in many ways, as you mentioned Edmund Burke, that was my period. So I was brought up actually to understand what it was to make modern Britain, if you follow me. And the construction of the constitutional arrangements, William Pitt, you know what I mean, and Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox versus Edmund Burke, Reflections on the French Revolution. You study this stuff and you begin to really discover what your country is. So I had this extraordinary experience of learning about the things that I became involved in later, but not really realizing that it would ever quite happen like that. I then married my wife. We've been married now for 61 years. Yeah. And we grew up together. Funnily enough, when I first started, I'm going to tell you, I was earning £3 a week as an article clerk, because that's what you did. And I did that for 3 years, and then I passed my law exams and so on. She, however, was earning 3 times as much as that. She was on £10 a week, and she was the secretary to Prime Minister in Downing Street. So we had a sort of extraordinary growing up period, and I'd known her for some time, and we've been married, and she'd be very glad that I was meeting up with all of you tonight. So that's that side of the story. But I did constitutional law, and that was really what I did for the whole of my legal life, and administrative law that went with it, public law, if you like. But actually, I got involved in some very interesting stuff. For example, I advised on the Grenada invasion with 1982, and I was actually the legal advisor to the Crown because, as it happened, there was a very dangerous situation in Grenada at the time. They were going to try and create a new Cuba, if you like. And to cut a long story short, which is quite a long story, but I advised that the American invasion was justified, which was not what the government thought. But the Queen was the Queen of Grenada as well as the Queen of the United Kingdom, so she had to take separate advice. And it turned out that, as it happens, I was right. And that was great. I didn't actually meet the Queen over this because you don't need to. It was done through her advisors, but that was fascinating. I also advised Quebec against Trudeau in relation to the Canadian provinces. So I've always really been on, shall we say, on the interlocutory side of things. I wasn't a government person. I was somebody who advised on the things that I saw as necessary and objectively so. And so I had a very independent sense of things. And you mentioned John Bright, I think. He was actually my great-grandfather's first cousin. So the man who created modern democracy, which was not Disraeli, by the way. Disraeli adopted it, but John Bright created it after the, in the 1867 Reform Act. Hodgkinson's amendment brought in an increase in democracy from around, I should think, maybe 400,000 people who had the vote in those days. They were all men. But in 1867, the moment that that went through, it rose to about 4.5 million. That was a huge change. That brought modern democracy for the working man. So that was a completely different kind of thing. And I grew up in this atmosphere. And then, as Sam said, and I love his mother, by the way, just to get that one in. I was selected for a Midland seat, which was marvellous, because I can tell you, Stoke-on-Trent, Sheffield, I mean, all this kind of stuff it's all part and parcel of my real life. You know, I'm not terribly enthusiastic about metropolitan Surrey and all the rest of it. To me, I want real people. And it was a wonderful experience to be the MP. I had the most wonderful association. And they were real people, and they, when it came to the Maastricht Rebellion, because I meant to get on to the substance of the issue, I had long, you see, for me, Euroscepticism wasn't about Europe. It was actually about Britain. So as far as I was concerned, it was the loss of our ability to govern ourselves. And the Chief Whip said to me, when I got into Parliament in 1984, we think it would be a nice idea if you went on to a select committee. And he said, perhaps the European Select Committee. And I said, well, by all means. He said, well, you know something about constitutional law, you know this stuff and that, and international law. And so he said, well, I can tell you that what they didn't realize was that it was transformative. Because although I had actually been aware of the constitutional changes, I hadn't realized just how invasive of British national interests it had been. And within 6 weeks, I came to the conclusion that I had to fight to make sure that the European Union, or the European Community as it was called in those days, was not going to completely saturate and effectively flatten the British constitutional arrangements. So the question for me was, who governs Britain? And Margaret Thatcher, with whom I became very, very close. In fact, at the end of, right at the end of Charles Moore's final volume, which is a magnificent biography, he devoted 2 pages to my relationship with her. And I didn't say this, I can only tell you what she said. And it was in the final chapters of the book. And it said that she came to believe, and she said to all her friends, Bill Cash is the torchbearer on all European issues for me. So that was really a rather interesting insight. I had known how close I was to her. We went on holiday together, she'd stay with us and so on. But she was a magnificent example, if I can put it to you bluntly, like William Pitt, like Edmund Burke, like Winston Churchill, of the greatness of this country. And she understood it, not only instinctively, but by leadership. That's exactly what Sam said, because this is what this is all about. And the Eddington Fellowship is about these questions. So I was sort of engaged in these amazingly significant moments. And when the legislation came through, in 1985-86, I gave a speech which is in Hansard, because I don't do invention, I don't myth-make. I do what I do, and it's there in Hansard, or it didn't happen, if you see what I mean. And I actually, I want to give you an example, because the word sovereignty hasn't been mentioned yet. This is about Britain and its sovereignty. And its sovereignty goes back to Alfred. His sovereignty goes back to the fact that we had a democracy which created an empire. We actually also had a sovereignty which delivered our ability to win in 2 world wars. This is not to be taken for granted. Britain is a very, very great country. And you, if I may say so, as young people, I'm 86 now, so I can look back a bit, and I can say to you that you are the future. And in fact, I think it was Disraeli, for whom I had a lot of appreciation as well, said that the young people of this world are the trustees of prosperity. And that is true. So you carry forward this sense of leadership and this understanding of how great the country is and its real traditional values. And I saw all this being completely eliminated by our membership of the European Union. And I will tell you something, after the Chief Whip, who subsequently said it was the best and the worst thing he ever did, because the best thing was that I was able to be part of this committee, for which I was a member for 40 years. I've been on one committee. In fact, they tell me I'm the longest standing member of any select committee in the history of Parliament. Well, 40 years is quite a long time. But I also discovered within 6 weeks, which is where I started off a few minutes ago to tell you, within 6 weeks, I'd spotted the procedures and the constitutional arrangements which had turned, through the European Communities Act of 1972, sections 1, 2 and 3, Parliament into a rubber stamp. It was that bad. I had been a constitutional law, but I'd never really studied it at that close range. So I just simply said, I'm going to fight this. And I made a speech the other day to the Freedom Association, and I said, at any price. And that price included, for example, the fact that you're not talking to somebody who is a Prime Minister or as a Cabinet Minister. I knew I could only fight this from the backbenches. It was impossible, given the establishment, the existence of the enactment of 72, the rubber stamp that was created whereby we were subjugated to all the laws made in Europe, which we'd agreed voluntarily that we would accept. And we obeyed every single law. Not one single law, not one comma of any European law, and I say comma, was ever rejected or amended from 1973 to 2020 when we left the European Union. And I made it my business to stay on the backbenches, to fight the battle for Britain, as I called it, in a book I wrote, for those of you who have ever heard of it, which you may not have done, but it's worth reading, if I may say. It was called Against a Federal Europe, published in 1991, The Battle for Britain. It wasn't about the battle for Europe or against Europe, it was the battle for Britain. So I then decided and was on the committee, and the more I learned, the more clear it became. And we then moved on to a whole series of potential movements towards political integration. And the more I saw, the deeper we were being thrust into it. And I say this with great respect to some other people who took a different view to me. They were going to have a fight on their hands, and they could only do that from the backbenches. So I led the Maastricht Rebellion, which was the moment after the Single European Act, which was about commercial arrangements, really. We increased the number of qualified majority votes to 350 in one act of parliament. So instead of our making our own laws, they were all made by Europe and imposed upon us by our own submission to it. I'm not going to say they imposed it on it without our agreeing it. I had to fight our own establishment in order to get them to agree that they would come out of it for themselves. Hence the Referendum Act eventually, because I came to the conclusion, and I'll tell you what the moment of truth was. I put down a sovereignty amendment, which was effectively saying we can't put up with this any longer, and nothing in this act shall derogate from the sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament. And I put down that amendment, and I got up to debate it in the debate in 1986. I remember it was June 1986. And I was told by the Deputy Speaker that I was not allowed to move this amendment. I said, but this is about the government of this country. How can I not be allowed to vote and speak on this amendment? He said, that is the way it's going to be. And I remonstrated, and I was on the point, really, of being thrown out of the chamber. And I realized that the power of this subjugation had so diminished their ability to see the wood for the trees, which was that from a constitutional point of view, we were actually being subjugated by our own abdication of our right to govern ourselves. And I said, in the speech that I gave later in another part of the committee stage, I said, if we do not get this right, and these are words that in Hansard, so I don't give you assertions, I tell you what's there. I said, we will reap the whirlwind. That's what I said. And I went on to say, who governs this country? Is it the European Commission? Is it the European Parliament? Is it our own refusal to allow ourselves to govern ourselves? What is going on? And from that moment on, I made a decision, which was that the only way I could defeat it was by remaining on the back benches. And the second thing was the fact that the constitutional arguments had to be deployed and to get it out into the public arena as well. Because it's no good just talking to yourselves in Parliament. You have to get it out into the public arena. And then, in a nutshell, I led the Maastricht Rebellion when John Major became Prime Minister and they assassinated Margaret Thatcher because they were Europhiles. And I'm writing my memoirs at the moment. And the chapter I have on Margaret Thatcher is very, very analytical. They believed, the Heathites they were, all believed passionately in being in the European Union, which also meant passionately making certain that we couldn't govern ourselves. This is so undemocratic that I could not believe what I was observing. So I then, John Major took over, and he made a speech in Germany, note, stating that he wanted to be at the very heart of Europe within a matter of 2 or 3 months after he'd helped to assassinate, or let me say, others had assassinated her, but he was the beneficiary of it. And the result was that he made the speech, which in a way was symbolic, because after all, if I may go back to 1940, I'm born, as it were, at the very moment of the birth of the Second World War. So you can see the significance of it, and my father being killed in the war and all this sort of stuff. So I led the Maastricht Rebellion. I created the European Foundation, which is now called the United Kingdom Sovereignty Foundation, because I changed the name this year because I felt that it was appropriate to make the change. Margaret Thatcher became patron. I was the chairman, and I still am, believe it or not, since 1993. And we were the absolute epitome of the arguments of the Eurosceptic movement, which developed out of all that. And we fought not only the Maastricht Treaty, but also a referendum, because the one thing that I'd realized when I was in that debate, when I was told I couldn't speak, was because the establishment and both sides